welcome everybody tonight. Dr. Les Wolf is presenting for us, but this is part of a broader festival here at the college hosted by the Humanities Department. And the theme that we've chosen for this year, because we think it's relevant, timely, and also kind of perennial, is the theme is contact. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague. If you're ready to go, Les.
I am. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay, excellent. So again, my name is Les Wolf. I teach philosophy and religious studies here at College of DuPage. I'm very excited to be here this evening. I've wanted to participate in Humanities Fest from the beginning. And this year I finally got my presentation together. And the full title, it's a bit of a mouthful, but here it goes. Making Contact with the Past, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Historical Periodization. So let's unpack this a bit. Making contact with the past. What is the idea here? It's about understanding the past. That's how I'm taking it. Making contact with the past, understanding the past. We could spend the whole time this evening talking about the importance of making sense of the past and understanding the past, but I'm sure all of us, we're already convinced of this. History is a discipline that is of great intrinsic interest, but it's also of tremendous instrumental importance. It's vitally important that we understand the past in order to understand ourselves and understand the present. So making contact with the past. What about historical periodization? Well, one question we could ask is this: how exactly can we go about making sense of the past? How do we do that? What are tools we can use for this? Well, one important tool that many historians use is historical periodization, but it's a bit controversial. Some historians would say it's a lot of good. Some would say it's a lot of bad. Some would say it can be downright ugly. So one thing we're going to talk about tonight, the main topic, is historical periodization. What is it? Does it really help us to make contact with the past? What are the virtues and vices of this? And yeah, that's the main topic. Before I go any further, I just want to say a few things. Number one, I am not a history professor. I'm not a professional historian. I am what you would call an amateur if you're being polite, or properly really a dilettante. I took a lot of history courses when I was an undergrad, more than philosophy and religion, and I teach about history, especially in my religion classes, and I still read a fair amount of history, but I'm not a professional historian. And so I marched down to the history department today, and I saw several professors, and I said, you must come this evening and point out all of the errors I'm going to make so I don't mislead the audience. And they said, no, we're not going to be there, Wolf. And they said, what's your thesis, though? And when I explained it, I'm not going to say it all right up front. You have to wait for that. But when I explained a bit of the thesis, I said, no, we sign off on that anyhow. So at least the history department, some of the members have approved the thesis, but I don't know if they'd approve all the arguments. But I'm not an historian, so I want to clarify that. Another thing I want to say is that our time slot was originally 7 to 7:30. I've practiced several versions of this presentation. They've all gone a bit over 30 minutes. I ran this by some of the organizers of Humanities Fest, including Professors Fotos and Price, and they all said it was fine. So they're to blame, right? They are not to blame. Okay, let's get into this. So you may have heard this expression that the past is a foreign country. Perhaps somewhat ironically, I didn't do a lot of historical research on the origin of this quotation, but a few Google searches seem to indicate that it dates to an individual, Lord David Cecil, in 1949, and then has been picked up and expanded on in various ways. And perhaps in some senses, it's not a helpful metaphor, but I think in some ways it is. And one way I like to approach the idea of making sense of the past, making contact with the past, is through the idea of making sense of the present, making contact with the present, in particular through the idea of traveling to a foreign country. So suppose you didn't know much about Spain, but you had some interest in it. And some friends said, hey, we just came back from Spain. It was really great. And you developed more interest in it, and you decided you wanted to visit Spain. I mean, how would you do this? How would you plan your trip? Well, at some point, you may look at a map to help orient you to the country, to help navigate the country, to help get a sense of the country, understand the country. And we would expect this map to have various landmarks on it. Some natural, such as mountains, mountain ranges, rivers, some man-made, like cities, villages, so forth and so on. Um, if we're looking at an individual city, such as Madrid, or a museum in Madrid, such as the Prado, we often turn to maps, and maps have landmarks. We do this with foreign countries. Well, we also often do this with the past. So if we're in Spain and we come across some Roman ruins, we might start thinking about the past of Spain, the history of Spain. We might try, just like we might try to place Madrid in the center north of the country, we might try to place the Roman period in what? The ancient world, the ancient part of history, right? If we, visit buildings like the Alhambra or the Mesquita, or we find ourselves in Toledo and we find ourselves faced with an old synagogue, and we start getting interested in the history of Jews and Christians and Muslims in Spain. One question we might have is, well, where do we place all of this, like on a map of the past, on a timeline of the past, perhaps? And it turns out that historians use various landmarks to help them do this, to help navigate the past, orient themselves to the past. So what are these landmarks? Well, here's some of the landmarks that historians use. Events, periods, and units of time. And actually, all three of these are involved in historical periodization. So we will look at all three in turn, beginning with events. Events may be short or long, simple or complex, natural or social. Okay. Importantly, they may overlap. They often do overlap, and they do not exhaustively partition the past. So, for example, the Renaissance overlaps the Protestant Reformation. The scientific revolution overlaps the Renaissance, things like this. Actually, maybe there's some debate about that, whether we should really say the scientific revolution overlaps the Renaissance by very much, but set that aside. So these events can overlap, and they do not exhaustively partition the past. This is going to be important for us in trying to understand historical periodization. So what would be some examples of events? We could talk about the reigns of individual rulers, such as Elizabeth I. We can talk about religious, intellectual, and artistic individuals and movements, such as the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Age of Shakespeare, scientific revolution, again, the Renaissance. We could talk about technological innovations, such as movable type printing press, gunpowder. We could talk about wars, battles, and invasions, such as the Battle of Tours, the Battle of Poitiers, the Battle of Hastings. We can talk about natural phenomena such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and plagues, like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the Black Death, the Lisbon earthquake. And so some of these are simple, some are complex, some are natural, some are social, but there they are, they're all events. And they're all framed more or less explicitly for a particular geographic region. Events. All right. I should have removed the highlights here, but here it goes. What about periods? We can think of periods in some different ways, but here's how we're going to think about them this evening. That periods are typically non-overlapping, and they typically partition the past or some sizable chunk of it exhaustively, more or less exhaustively. Let me just give an example here. If you look down a little bit on the PowerPoint, you'll see these three words set off under the third point: ancient, medieval, modern. This evening, we're mostly focused on Western history, or really European history, or really Western European history, specifically of the last 3,000 years. And when we look at that chunk of time, what we see is that for several centuries now, historians, by and large, have carved it up into three periods: ancient, medieval, modern. And the idea here is that these periods are non-overlapping, they're discrete. And the idea here is also that they're exhaustive. So what does that mean? That means that if we take any day in the last 3,000 years in Western Europe, that day is going to fall under one and only one of these periods. It will be ancient, medieval, or modern. It won't be two, it won't be three. It'll be exactly one and at most one, that's it. Non-overlapping or discrete, and an exhaustive partition. Now we can take these periods and divide them into sub-periods. So for example, with the modern period, we might divide it up into early modern, late modern. Medieval, we might talk about early, high, late Middle Ages, things like this. Ancient, divide up into Greco-Roman, and then we could actually go even further than that. We can also place these periods in what you might call super periods. So Common Era, before Common Era, Common Era. There are alternative ways of carving up this last 3,000 years of Western European history into periods, and we will briefly discuss a few. But most historians for a long, long time now, for centuries now, have used ancient, medieval, modern as their main three. Okay? And again, these are defined for geographic regions. I mean, it is common for us to lift up these periods and drop them in other parts of the world, talking about medieval India, medieval China, medieval Japan. But a lot of historians would say, don't do that. And a lot of us might see without even this discussion, that might not always make the most sense. Okay, so we talked about events a little bit. We talked about periods. What about units of time? Well, for a while now, a lot of historians have used different units of time to construct timelines, on which to chart periods and events. So what units of time could we be looking at? Millennia, those obviously, 1,000-year periods, those are quite long. Centuries and decades. What ends up happening very often is that we end up treating centuries as periods unto themselves. And that often leads to various problems because, as many historians remark, you're not always guaranteed to have a lot of interesting things happening when a new century starts and an old one ends. And often we end up, kind of fudging things a bit. Like we might say, oh, well, the Enlightenment was in the 18th century. But the thing is we find some Enlightenment activity continuing into the 1800s, and we find a fair amount already in the 1600s. But when we're stuck with these centuries, we often want to put it all in one century. And so we kind of like the 1700s. Well, that doesn't always work super well. And that's actually related to some of the problems that I'm going to discuss tonight. So what we see today is historians of all stripes, past and present, professional and amateur, are often employing historical periods, with these units of time to make sense of history. And we call this historical periodization. And just to fill this out a little bit more, I'm going to mean something fairly technical by historical periodization this evening. I'm going to have in mind this fairly specific practice of taking a fairly large chunk of time over a more or less well-defined territory, such as Western Europe, and identifying a handful of periods that are discrete, non-overlapping, and that exhaustively partition time in that period, where the periods themselves are defined in terms of events or families of events or families of events, where we can get sub-periods and super periods being defined in terms of events, and where we're charting all of this using some units of time, such as millennia, centuries, and decades. It's a bit complicated, and it's actually, this is really what a lot of historians do. It's what a lot of historians do, right? Just to say a little more here before we move on, once I lay this out like this, it might seem that this is an obvious way to approach the past. It might seem like it's an inevitable way to approach the past. I mean, how else could we do history, right? And actually, it turns out a lot of ancient historians didn't have anything like all of this structure, right? A lot of ancient historians, they just talk purely in terms of events. They didn't have these big periods to put them into. They weren't necessarily using these units of time. A lot of ancient historians, they would just talk about, well, so-and-so is king, so-and-so is queen, there is a battle, there is a plague, and that was it, and that's it. And so it actually turns out we have written history. We wrote it for a long time without all of this structure, But we do use the structure today. We've used it for a while. Well, why do we do that? This is something I'm not super clear on. I haven't read a lot on how this apparatus of periodization developed, but I mean, I have a guess. You know, I mean, you look at how it's used today. You know, maybe one thing that went on in the minds of some historians was this: is they said, look, we've got a bunch of events, but we want to connect them to one another. We want some kind of context in which to place these events. And that when they started to do that, they started to note some continuities and discontinuities. And this seems kind of naturally to just lead into the idea of historical periodization. And it might seem kind of actually, again, at least, so maybe it's not strictly speaking inevitable or unavoidable, but if we want these larger analytical frameworks, you know, context for events and to relate events to one another, you might think, hey, we should do that. That's a deeper level of understanding, and this is how we're going to do it. Now, be that as it may, it actually turns out that a lot of historians are highly critical of this whole idea of historical periodization. And we really have a spectrum of views here. And my sense is, I would expect, you know, even the historians who are the most critical of historical periodization would agree that there's been some improvement in the way we think about this over recent decades. We were at least making a lot of mistakes in the past we're no longer making. At the same time, there's, you know, probably every historian today is critical of at least some aspects of this. So we can all agree that there's been some improvement, but still some way to go. And actually, there's a real spectrum here. On the one hand, you have some historians who would say, look, historical periodization is necessary and even good, and it helps a lot. And by the way, ancient, medieval, modern actually make a lot of sense, for at least for Western Europe. And yeah, we might need to finesse those a little bit and refine them a little bit, but we're, you know, we're pretty much good. We got a nice structure here. Don't mess with it too much. And we have some other historians who say, no, no, no. Look, historical periodization is necessary, even can be good, but this ancient, medieval, modern are very bad. Like we should just junk that scheme, or at least most of it, or completely rewrite it. Like the current scheme really needs to be totally overhauled, but there's a way to do that, and we can get something useful out of it. Now, if you go a little further down the line, you can find some folks who would say, no, historical periodization is inherently bad. It's bad and it's ugly, and there's no fixing it. And we should just dump historical periods altogether and cease this nonsense of historical periodization. Um, you know, and among these people, we might divide them up a bit. Some of these people are still pretty optimistic about our ability of achieving real historical knowledge, and some might actually be quite skeptical and say, you know, like periods are bad landmarks for the past, and there are no good landmarks for the past, and we can't really make much sense of the past. A kind of historical skepticism, which I really hope is not true, that we're that badly off. And so in the rest of this presentation, what I want to do is this. I want to just say a little more about the theory and practice of historical periodization. And then I want to explore those criticisms. And I'll just give a little preview of the conclusions that I would draw from all of this. And here would be my conclusions. I started reading about this in earnest a few years ago, largely through reading about history of science and also reading about the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and seeing a lot of historians critique historical periodization in connection with these topics. And at first I was a little skeptical, but the more and more time has passed, the more and more I read about this, the more and more I think about it, I actually come more and more to sympathize a great deal with even the most trenchant criticisms of historical periodization. And I think maybe we should think about just giving it all up altogether. You know, not only giving up ancient, medieval, modern, but not even really trying to replace it with anything. Just give it up altogether. At the same time, I think that may really be difficult to do for various reasons. And so I have some concerns about that as well, some questions, which I'll mention at the very end. All right, so let's continue. I mentioned some sources here. I'll skip that. Okay, let's just say a little more about the theory and practice of historical periodization. One thing we really need to understand here is how historical periods are supposed to capture moments, trends of stability and instability, of stability and change, of continuity and discontinuity. And so here's the idea. Suppose we wanted to say that a major period of history ends in the year, oh, I'll write this out in the chat, even though I think it should be clear if I say it, but here it goes. Suppose we want to say that a particular period of history, major period of history, ends in 476 CE. Now, actually, as it turns out, for hundreds and hundreds of years, we were told by historians that the ancient period did end in 476 CE. For hundreds and hundreds of years, historians said that the ancient period ended here and the medieval period started. Well, why? If the ancient period ends here and the medieval period starts here, we expect there to be some big change. If historians said the ancient period ends here and the medieval period begins here, why? What happened in 476? Nothing. Nothing interesting happened in 476. Did anything interesting happen in 477 or 475? No. Nothing interesting happened for decades on either side of 476. It would make no sense to say that the ancient period ends there and the medieval period begins. I mean, obviously things are changing all the time, but if there's a certain time, a certain stretch in history where things are very stable, like across the board, that's not when a period ends and a new period begins. That's when a period continues, right? Similarly, if we were to ask about, now as it turns out, actually, again, historians told us for centuries that 476 was big and the ancient period did end there and the Middle Ages did start there. Why? Because the fall of the Roman Empire happened in 476. We'll come back to that. Now, if you tell me that the Roman Empire fell in 476, I'm going to say, okay, now that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Now I see why you want to say the ancient period ends here and the medieval period ends here, because the Roman Empire fell. Okay, that makes sense. But if nothing happened, then you wouldn't say that. Similarly, we could go back to, let's say, 100 CE. And suppose it turns out that there are radical changes at like all levels of society at that time. Well, then we would want to see at least a sub-period, beginning and ending, at the sub-periods beginning and ending, maybe a major period. I mean, if everything's changing at all levels of society, as much change is occurring at other times where you have a turnover in periods, then we should have one here too. If the periods don't track continuity and discontinuity in these ways, they're useless. They're landmarks to nothing. They're supposed to be tracking continuity and discontinuity in these ways. And actually, I've been talking for a little bit. Can we just stop and can I just ask you to type in the chat? Does that make sense? Or are we on the same page with this? Can you all put in the chat? Okay, cool. So let's continue then. Good to see some of my students in the chat. Yeah, I like that too. I just came up with that. So what would be the problem then with all this? Well, there's a couple. Let's start looking at it. Problem number one, societal and geographic complexity. So there was a source earlier that went by. Actually, maybe I'll go back up to the source. So if you wanted to look at just one source on these topics, Hamish Scott, who is a modern European historian, who writes books on the Habsburgs and things like that. He recently edited this 2-volume set, the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern European History. And by the way, note the dates for the early modern period here, 1350 to 1750. And Scott has a nice introduction to both volumes. And one thing that Scott says, and this is a bit surprising to me, but he's the expert, I'm the dilettante, so here it goes. Scott says that up until about the middle of the last century, so maybe like up through the 1950s, that when historians were, thinking of periods, historical periods and subperiods, they had this basic understanding that periods are supposed to track, large trends of continuity and discontinuity, stability and change. But there's this question that arises: what are the indices of change and stability, the measures of continuity and discontinuity? What are we looking to? What's changing or staying the same? And I mean, that's a critical question. I mean, we can't do anything with these periods until we have some measures of change and stability. And Scott says that up until maybe again about the 1950s or so, historians tended to only do high culture history. They were really just looking at like kings and queens, like highest level of government, and high level culture, sometimes with some battles and wars and plagues and such. And that's basically all they really looked at, which in some ways, honestly, is maybe not much of an advance over, I mean, Thucydides, had that, right? Herodotus had that. So maybe it's not much of an advance over historians we had in ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So he also goes on to say, and it's a little surprising to me, but okay, he's the expert. He also goes on to say that in the last 70 years, uh, historians have gotten a lot more sophisticated, a lot more rigorous on this. And they've said, oh, wait a second. Society today involves a lot more than just ruling elites and high culture and wars and plagues, right? If we recognize all these different elements and components of culture today, why aren't we doing that for ancient cultures? And so then they say, we should start tracking demographics such as birth rates and life expectancy and so forth and so on. We should start tracking economic activity, including manufacturing, trade, and commerce. We should start in monetary policy. We should start tracking material culture and consumption habits, not just of the elites around clothing and housing and all the rest. Dietary habits, transportation, communication, gender and sexuality, popular religion, and more. And then things get a lot more complicated. And the problem is, it turns out that the more measures, the more indices of stability and change you recognize, then more and more you can end up in these scenarios. And it turns out they're just everywhere, where we have some pretty massive change on some of these measures, but little or no major change on the others. And then the question arises, well, where do we stop and start our periods or our subperiods? And we want to be careful here. We don't want to say that just because we can't achieve perfect objectivity in history or anything else, we're hopelessly trapped in subjectivity and we can't escape subjectivity and just lose all confidence in any of our judgments. At the same time, a lot of historians worry that actually once we see how complex this is, it's very, very difficult to really arrive at confident, mature judgments that aren't hopelessly steeped in subjectivity and bias and researcher interest and all the rest of it. And actually, it seems like it can be really quite difficult. That'd be problem number one, right? And by the way, just to mention an interesting example here that some of you may be aware of. I said earlier that for centuries we had historians saying that the ancient period ends in 476. A lot of historians don't believe that anymore. Thinking about that has changed a lot in the last couple decades, largely due to this historian, Peter Brown, who spent a lot of his career at Princeton. And, Peter Brown did what scholars should always do. He said, everybody in my field says X. Is X really true? Everybody says the Roman Empire ended in 476. Did it? Or did the ancient period end in 476? Well, the Roman Empire ends in 476 in some sense, because these barbarians, and actually this will be relevant later, even these terms like barbarians are really complicated. A lot of scholars say these barbarians were heavily Romanized. I mean, actually everything I'm about to say becomes very complicated, but we'll just stick with the simple version of this, right? Actually, a lot of the more complex version, I don't even know the details of it. But these barbarians put an end to Roman governance of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Odoacer, this German barbarian, deposed the last Roman emperor, and that was the end of the Roman Empire. Now, is that true? Well, in a sense, yeah. I mean, there was a continuity of emperors that came to an end, right? And there were some pretty significant changes that followed in terms of governance across that whole region. But does that mean we should say that the whole ancient period came to an end? And Brown said, no. Well, why not? Because he said, look at all these other measures of society, of stability and change. Look at all these other dimensions of society. And a lot of them, very little changed at this time. There was enormous stability, enormous continuity at this time. For a lot of people, they didn't really notice all that much. It didn't matter to them all that much. And if that's the case, then maybe we shouldn't say that the whole ancient period came to an end just because things changed among some elites. And pretty much most historians of the ancient period said, you're right. So we don't say there's a few holdouts like Brian Ward Perkins at Oxford, but a lot of historians said, you're right. We're not going to say the ancient period came to an end anymore in 476. So what are we going to say? We're going to posit a new period called late antiquity. Yeah. Joe read that book. Joe, did you like that book? Yeah. He says we're going to posit this new period called late antiquity, which is going to end maybe somewhere around 700 or 750 or 800 CE. And when are we going to start that? Maybe around actually 100 CE. You might say, actually, this isn't so bad. This is good. This is how it's supposed to work. This is saying historical periods, whether necessary or not, can really work and work well and be very useful. And now people write whole books on late antiquity and late antique philosophy and all the rest of it. But I will say there are a lot of other examples that are far from this clean. They're a lot messier, and we'll go on to talk about some more of that. Before we do go on, one thing I would say is another problem we have here is not just with it's not just one of like change in a particular place, it's change over a region. Because again, we're defining these events, these periods for certain regions back to physical maps. And if you look at something like industrialization, which by the way, a lot of historians would say that there's many factors involved in the closing of early modernity and the rise of late modernity, but industrialization is often taken to be one of these. And then it turns out, well, what do we do with that? Because if we're looking at Western Europe, never mind Eastern Europe, just Western Europe, industrialization doesn't occur equally at the same time all over Western Europe. There's a lot of disparity here. So what do we do? This is another complication we run into, and it can get really, really kind of nasty. Related to this, one thing I find really interesting, one thing that got me so interested in this in the first place is that my PhD is in philosophy. And if you read a lot of history of philosophy, and a lot of historians of philosophy, fortunately, do not engage with larger history. I think this is a major shortcoming of that field. But a lot of historians of philosophy, virtually all of us, say that the early modern period of philosophy began with René Descartes. By the way, was born in 1596 and died in 1650. And like his main work, the Meditations, I don't think was written until about 1641, something like that. So we have all these philosophers saying that modernity, the modern period, begins about 1650, maybe 1620, 1630, 1640, but let's 1650. If we look at what general historians write, you can think again, Hamish Scott, 2-volume set, Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Europe. The subtitle includes 1350 to 1750. And Scott will tell you that for a long time, a lot of historians said the Middle Ages end about 1500. Now notice that nice century again, December 31st, 1499, you're in the Middle Ages. But you wake up the next day, you're a modern person now. And the historians for a long time said 1500, but now we're pushing it back to 1350, maybe even earlier. But then if we talk to art historians, they often want to take the modern period. I actually looked at this last night. MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, says industrialization, like the mid 1700s. Other websites and sources would say, no, 1800s, maybe late 1800s. Some would say, no, it's even later than that. But you can find a lot of art historians saying modernity begins around 1850. So we have a 500-year gap here for the beginning of modernity. And actually, if you look at different fields like literature, philosophy, art, you have all these scholars saying, no, 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 modernity begins here, no, it begins here, no, it begins here, no, it begins here. Well, why the disagreement? Because they're not trying to look at all those measures of stability and change, continuity and discontinuity. They're only looking at like one or two. They're looking at a small handful. But then notice what the general historian is doing. They're trying to take a composite of all of this. How do we do that? So we just pull all the professors and all the different specialties and then average it? And I mean, that's not that. Obviously, that's absurd. That doesn't even come close to matching. That's not close to what the general historians would do. And they would say it's completely wrong. Well, what are we tracking here? I think it's a serious issue if you just look at the way the different specialties do this. Here's some other problems. I'll try and wrap this up as soon as I can. Change is often really slow, and sometimes it's gradual, though I kind of even want to back away from the word gradual, because gradual might imply there's a steady, linear, but slow increase when it doesn't always work like that. Here's an example I find really interesting, because I teach philosophy, is Thomas Aquinas. He dies in 1274. That's the Middle Ages. If there is Middle Ages, Thomas is Middle Ages, like maybe late Middle Ages, maybe, but he's Middle Ages. But the thing is that if we continue reading philosophy after Thomas, we can see all the way to the time of Francisco Suarez and beyond. Suarez, by the way, is, I think, the greatest Western philosopher that nobody's, has heard of, or not many people have heard of. He's an amazing scholastic philosopher. There's this amazing philosophy coming out of Spain and Portugal at this time. And you read this stuff from the late 1500s and early 1600s, and it reads very much like Thomas Aquinas. Very, very much like Thomas Aquinas. But now we're in the modern period. Even if you go back to the old way of dating, where the Middle Ages ended in like 1499, this stuff is still modern, but it reads just like Thomas in many respects, right? To give another example that I find really, really interesting, Galileo Galilei died in 1642. He's often regarded as one of the architects of the scientific revolution. Some say he's like the greatest figure and exponent of the scientific revolution. And this is supposed to be very, 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 very modern. But you read his young physics. For example, he wrote this work, De Motu, of motion, that he finished about 1590. And it is exactly like ancient physics. If someone gave you, if you read just stacks and stacks of ancient physics, and someone handed you this manuscript by Galileo and took his name off, you would place it in the ancient period without any question. And Galileo himself actually admits that. He actually says 2 months after he finished this theory, he discovered, I mean, I really wonder if this isn't it. He says he discovered that every single thing he said had been taught by Hipparchus, who died back in 120 BCE. And actually, I think you could find ancient physicists like John Philoponus, whose physics is actually a good deal more sophisticated than Galileo's early stuff in 1590. So what are we supposed to say then about Galileo? He's modern, even though his young thought is like totally ancient? Was he like ancient when he was in his 20s and modern in his 40s, and he just skipped the Middle Ages? Like, it's weird. We could talk about a little more about Descartes, also great architect of the scientific revolution, a great Copernican, a great opponent of Aristotle. He's often, by the way, why do a lot of philosophers say he's the first modern? Because he was the first person that was really able to bury Aristotle and ancient. It was the first person, like Galileo really didn't do this because he didn't build systems, and Hobbes didn't do this because he didn't have a good system, and Bacon tried to have a system, but it didn't really work. But Descartes is like the first modern because he gave us this whole full-blooded system that was able to bury Aristotle and move us beyond the ages. Except we have more and more historians today saying that his thought is deeply rooted in St. Augustine. Well, then is it so modern? Well, maybe it is and it isn't, but something's not supposed to be medieval and modern at the same time, is it? So here's another example we can talk about before I move on. Again, these periods are supposed to be discrete, non-overlapping. Middle Ages ends, early modern begins. Some historians place the Renaissance at the end of the Middle Ages, but most say it's early modernity. How do we even decide that? How do we even decide that? Do we even have any good criteria for making those kinds of arguments? A lot of historians actually more might say, no, this is kind of arbitrary. The thing is that we're looking back to the Renaissance people, and we're trying to figure out, well, to what extent do they really remind us of ourselves? And in some ways they do, in some ways they don't. But we can go all the way back to Aristotle doing that same game. Where do you cut this off? How much of yourself do you have to see in Aristotle before you decide whether he's modern, medieval, or ancient? How do we even come close to quantifying this? Can we even do it all that well qualitatively? But what we have a lot of historians pointing out is that when you look at the early modern period, you see a lot of the Middle Ages in it. And when you look back to the Middle Ages, you see a lot of the early modern period in it. Well, why are we distinguishing between them like this? And one way you might try to solve this is say, here's what we do. Just revise the theory. Just drop the stipulation that the periods have to be discrete and non-overlapping, and let them overlap, at least at the beginnings and end, by maybe 50 years. That still is not going to solve all of these issues, because you could go back well over 50 years, 100 years, before the Middle Ages is supposed to end and still find some strong elements of modernity. We could read Galileo and see ancient physics in Galileo, like, 1,500 years later. You don't want to let, there could be a 1,500-year overlapping period. I mean, that doesn't make any sense anymore. You know what I mean? That's a whole period. Right. By the way, another problem with this is these periods still end up being really long, and there's tons of change over them. Okay, I got to wrap up here. So let me do this. This may be last main thing I will mention, and before I just wrap up with a little bit of an analysis on this reflection. Periods are often drawn ideologically. So where do we get this idea of ancient, medieval, modern? Well, if you read books like John Arnold's What is Medieval History, which is a really nice book, or you read Hamish Scott, or everybody I've read on this, they all say it's all Petrarch's fault. Petrarch, this great, I think he was born in 1304 and something like that. I don't know, maybe that's too early. Died in 1374, this great Renaissance thinker. For a long time we used to say that he began the Renaissance. Now we say no, he was just one major early exponent of it. But Petrarch was, as far as we know, Petrarch was the first person who actually came up with this idea of three major periods of history for like the last 3,000 years of Western European history. Now, he did not use the term Middle Ages. I think he did use ancient and modern. I think he just called the Middle Ages the dark times, right? But he was the guy who came up with this scheme. And why did he come up with it? Here's what Petrarch said. Ancient times were great. Cicero, Livy, right? Like great culture, great letters, right? Great poetry. Ancient period, great. Ancient Romans and Greeks, great. High culture, great culture. Middle Ages, total darkness, total barbarism. Like nothing good happens in the Middle Ages. It's a cultural waste. Modern period, great, wonderful, culture being reborn, Renaissance, Rinascimento, culture, civilization being relaunched through what? Recovery of ancient culture. Who's doing that? Me, Petrarch. I'm relaunching all civilization. Thank me later. Thank me now, he actually said. And the thing is just there's this thing, the genetic fallacy, and just because an idea has some bad motivations to it doesn't mean it's wrong or useless. But the thing is so many people to this present day still buy into what Petrarch said. A lot of historians of science will say it's embarrassing. We bought into this until only a handful of decades ago. For centuries, you had, until fairly recently in a lot of fields, you had people just regurgitating Petrarch's thing. Ancient period, great culture. Middle Ages, zero zip zilch. Modernity, all wonderful, amazing, culture reborn. But now, I mean, any historian, and again, this can get ideological and political and all this, and it's often bound up with the Catholic Church and whatnot. But I mean, the thing is that even hardcore atheists at Harvard will tell you this is a joke. There is amazing literature and philosophy and science going on all through the Middle Ages. We still have a lot of people regurgitating Petrarch on this. We have a lot of historians of science saying it's embarrassing. We let Petrarch actually tell us what was what for way too long. And by the way, a lot of the architects of the scientific revolution, like Descartes and Galileo, they seize on this scheme of Petrarch's, of the Renaissance humanists. And they say there was no real science before us. There was no real philosophy before us, at least in the Middle Ages. It was all junk. And then it turned out actually a lot of stuff happened in the Middle Ages that actually we can find the fingerprints of over in the work of a lot of these architects of the scientific revolution. And so I just wonder, how useful are these terms, right? Just to, and there's a lot more examples we can talk about here. A lot of times when people think of the Middle Ages, they think of like knights and jousting. Well, a lot of people who lived in the Middle Ages never saw any jousting. A lot of times we think of castles. Well, there's castles before and after the Middle Ages. Right. When we think of the ancient period, we often think of Greece and Rome. Well, what about all the influence from the Middle East on ancient letters? A lot of our scholars are saying more and more we see the fingerprints of Middle Eastern storytelling on Homer. We see the fingerprints of ancient Babylonian astronomy all over ancient Greek astronomy. That just gets left out because it's just Greece and Rome. This is an issue with our physical maps now. And this one other one with religion. We often think of the Middle Ages. This is when people were very, very religious, and modern people aren't religious. Except we have more and more evidence coming out that there were plenty of atheists and skeptics in the Middle Ages. Now, a lot of them were quiet about it because you could get yourself killed for that, right? But we had plenty of atheists and agnostics and all sorts of religious skeptics in the Middle Ages, and we had it in the ancient world too, in Greece and India and other parts of the world. And it's not just so that picture that everybody in the Middle Ages was just devoutly religious, not so. We have some scholars like Stephen Menn arguing that to a large extent, Europe didn't even really get Christianized until the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. We have scholars like C.A. Bailey arguing actually religion is very strong throughout the heart of the modern period. And in some ways it even expands. And when we hear those things, we just think, well, that's crazy because I know what the Middle Ages are. That's when people jousted and stuff. And a lot of historians are, this is bad. Like these terms are not helping us. They're just perpetrating all these errors and stereotypes and all the rest, and they are not helping. One other thing, the Enlightenment. A lot of people think, what's like the quintessentially, modern intellectual movement, the Enlightenment, except so many of those ideas we already see in ancient Greece. Which isn't to say there's nothing new with Voltaire, but so what do we do? Well, again, some people would say we need new periods. So there's some German scholars who said we should take 1250 to 1750 as a period. Well, maybe one problem with that is if we have a scholar like Bailey taking 1780 to 1914 to be a time of great compatibility and stability. Now do we want to go from 1250 to 1914? That seems like a bit of a stretch. It's really hard to come up with good alternatives to this. And so you might actually think what we need to do is junk it. Just junk it all, just get rid of it all. I will just, my last thought on this, I will say, as tempting as that may be, and I wish there were some history professors here to tell me why I'm wrong about this, but I do worry about whether we can do that. I mean, words like ancient, medieval, modern are so entrenched in our minds today. People have been using the word modern for centuries and centuries. That's not going away. Another issue I think we have here is that even if you start to unpack words like Judaism, Christianity, philosophy, science, the word history itself, it turns out a lot of these same problems arise. But we're not going to stop talking about Judaism or Christianity or philosophy or science or history. And honestly, we might need to actually have some of this framework around to try and straighten out some of those terms. So I don't know what we do, but I hope you see at the very least that it's very, very important we make contact with the past. It's such a vast foreign country. It's reasonable to ask how we could get our bearings and look for some landmarks. It's really difficult to actually find some landmarks that don't frustrate understanding as well as they might facilitate it. And we constantly have to be in this process of examining yesterday's scholarship and trying to figure out where it went wrong. I once heard an historian say 50% of what historians do is trying to figure out what our colleagues did yesterday was wrong. And I've heard some other historians say that's a low ball. So anyhow, that's all. Thank you all for anybody who's still here, I hope you found this um, worth the limited amount of time that you have on the planet Earth. I don't know, maybe we could have some discussion, questions, comments. I don't know. What do y'all think?
Yeah, I think we definitely have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has any or comments, thoughts, it'd be great. So we've got a question from Dr. Schiffman. So Les, what period are we in now?
It's always the modern period. It's always that late modernity, contemporary period. I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Adam and Josh. My sense is, in some fields, people like to take late modernity up to maybe World War II, and then talk about the contemporary period after that. Does that is that sound right to y'all?
I mean, I think, I mean, I'm always going to think in the context of art, and yeah, like I mean, I think I always I think in my arts and cultural diversity class, we've been thinking a little bit about modernity and post-modernity and like what that means, but then also like we're looking at Dewey now and thinking about some of his ideas, which are, you know, often said like, well, they're like a little bit postmodern and how he's, you know, so looking away from ideals and things. And I don't know, I guess because it's art anyway, it's you kind of get used to the fuzziness of things, like and how to sort of like categorize. Like you could put a category on it, but you know that there's going to be some, you know, permeability to the way we try to capture it.
Yeah, like let's just add a disclaimer every time.
Yeah, so I was interested. I mean, this is really an interesting question that you're raising, Les. I mean, one of the things that I think might be useful with regards to periodization is that, you know, it can give a kind of insight into how the species has changed through, you know, in thinking about like both continuity and change. So, you know, I read with students this little piece from Benjamin Constant, and it's, you know, he's addressing the liberty of the ancients versus that of the moderns. And he's, you know, in the ancients, you know, in the ancient world for him, you know, it's kind of like this, you know, it's this like from like all of civilization up to the point in which you know, you see modernity emerging, you know, maybe 1500s or however we want to play that out. Obviously, there's like kernels of it prior to that. But what's interesting is that he actually looks back to somewhere like Athens, and he'll say, you know, that there's a kind of proto modern in Athens in terms of its kind of commercial aspect. And so like, you know, there's like there's a modern kind of a proto-modern aspect to Athens. And yet it was, you know, the individual is assumed by the collective, right? Like, you know, he goes through these differences. And so he's kind of, sorry, I'm letting somebody in. So it's kind of the continuity and change as a kind of registering the way the species has changed. And, you know, I think like, you know, of course, like kind of professional historians, you know, they'll pick and prod, right? But we do see, you know, I think you can draw some kind of like line. You can always kind of push against it one way or the other, but there is a kind of transformation of the species. You know, you remark, you know, the Protestant Reformation, the scientific, you know, the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, right? You know, the kind of technical revolution and so forth, that there seems to be a change that of course you can see in the past, but from the perspective of the present, or you know, of the present that people are writing about. you know, and there used to be people that thought about history as, you know, basically the development or unfolding of the consciousness of freedom, right? That we're actually, you know, like that kind of going back to Hegel and so forth. But I think like your questions are more in line with like the things that are happening in the 19th century of like what's going on with all this historicism, you know, like it's like a sickness where we're doing all the jot and tittles of whatever. Yeah, but I just, you know, I wonder like in terms of the usefulness of the periodizations to reflect humanity's self-transformation, if that's, you know, if that's like a worthy reason to kind of hold on to these, you know, these eras or periods or whatever.
No, I think that's great. That's really helpful. And again, I'm not trained as a historian of philosophy either, right? So this is just my, you know, an opinion. Take it for what it's worth. But well, maybe I should be a little firmer about it with the first point. I mean, yeah, obviously there's a lot of change over time, but you have a lot of discontinuity, but you also have continuity. And sometimes the discontinuities are pretty big, and it makes sense to try to chunk that out in some way and have some kind of analytical framework for that. Absolutely, I think that really does make sense. I think it's inevitable. That's why I say I'm not, even as much as I sympathize with some of this, I just don't know how we get away from it. Maybe actually one thing that your comments lead me to think is this. Maybe what we should say is this: it's totally fine to basically do what we're doing in the various specialties. Maybe the problem is when we try to have the general historian come along and sort of crunch all of this together. Yeah, that's where a lot of the issues coming from, because a lot of the problems I described, when you look at specialties, these problems just kind of resolve themselves because we're not trying to juggle so many different measures of stability and change. But I do worry though that terms like ancient, medieval, modern, they can be really distorting for us in a lot of ways, because I think often it's just the way our minds work. We tend to just see total radical discontinuity with no continuity. And maybe what we could do is just try to train ourselves better. And if scholars have only been doing this relatively recently, maybe we shouldn't be too pessimistic about getting the general public to do this, right? Maybe we just need to give more time and try to train ourselves better to note the continuities along with the discontinuities. And those can be overblown, right? So famously, for centuries, historians of science and scientists and philosophers of science, everybody agreed that Galileo was completely 100% new, his mature work, and no antecedents and anything prior to him. And then people went the other way and they said there's nothing new in Galileo. It's all done in the Middle Ages. And that's not right. Like, for all of his propaganda and self-promotion, he did some new stuff, like some really important new stuff. And it makes sense to, like, we need to mark that. You know, so again, maybe the real issue here is like we're really good at noting discontinuities, so maybe sometimes we overblow those. So like we need to get better at noting the continuities.
Yeah, I mean, I was, I always present my students like with Hobbes, for example, right? That like Hobbes sides with the British crown, right? There's a way in which like Hobbes sides with the crown, and one might be tempted to believe that this is a kind of in deference to God made the king or whatever, right? Like this the language of traditional civilization. But actually he does so, right, on the basis of his view of human nature. And so, that's different, right? So there's continuity and change, right? And I think, I guess I wouldn't point to Galileo, but rather like Newton, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I take your point in terms of like, I always kind of give the simple timeline, like 1500s is like my, 16th century, the beginning of the bourgeois epoch or modernity.
Yeah.
But of course, like you can kind of point to earlier stuff, but also my Benjamin Constant point is that you can see the present in the past. For example, him looking at Athens. And it raises the question of like, what if history is a theory of the present, right? In the way in which we understand ourselves in the present. And in that way, there may have been things that have happened in the past that have gone unremarked upon, right? That might be valuable in the future.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I guess we just have to keep revising and doing better. That's just part of the the task of scholarship. But it is interesting. But I'll just say again, like one thing I find very interesting is just how powerful words such as ancient, medieval, and modern can really be for us. How charged those words can be in words like philosophy and science. And just to talk a little bit more about science, there's these huge debates. So these are parallel debates. Like there's huge debates among historians of science of when does science begin? And for a long time, a lot of people want to say it started with the Greeks. And then people say, no, 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 it starts with the scientific, revolution, like with Copernicus and Kepler and Bry and Descartes and Boyle and Galileo and Newton. And then some say not even Newton, because Newton still believes in alchemy and Newton's still appealing to God and doing physics. And there's stuff in the Principia that just comes, that talks about the soul. And so, we'll say science starts in like late 1700s. And we have all these and then a lot of people are now saying, no, 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 it goes back to ancient Babylon. And other people say, no, 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 it began with the beginning of our species. And then you might say, why would you think Neanderthals didn't engage in science? Why restrict this to Homo sapiens, right? And so I don't know, like, what do we do here? And the only sense I can make of it is to say, look, we look at where we're at in the present and we try to figure out where we're at in the present. And then as we go back, we ask ourselves, how much do we see of ourselves in these people? How much continuity and discontinuity? And we can see a lot more continuity between Einstein and Newton than we can between like Einstein and Descartes, and Einstein and John Philoponus, or Einstein, you know what I mean? And we just keep taking it back. But even back to the ancient Babylonians, we see some real continuity. We see development of mathematical, not to title science to mathematical methods, but we see development of mathematical methods, even, applied to developing functions to try to yield predictions of where bodies are going, heavenly bodies are going to be in the future. And that looks pretty scientific. Then we learned that these people never asked about the structure of the cosmos, or because they just thought it's the gods talking to them. Well, that doesn't sound very scientific. And sometimes I wonder, like, what I would say is, the one thing I think we absolutely have to do as best as we can is chart the real continuities and discontinuities, being very careful about the limited data we have access to and biases are in our analysis of it. I think then the labels we start putting on it, that's where things get complicated. But Josh, you're absolutely right. And we don't want to obliterate all of this and just pretend that, if Plato met Hegel, what I'm saying, they would like perfectly understood one another over glasses of sherry or whatever. They would not,
Because for Hegel, in terms of like the movement of history, the unfolding, the development of the consciousness of freedom, he has this idea that like, he says like in the Oriental phase, one was free. In the classical phase, some were free, right? Like the citizens. But in the kind of modern epoch, we recognize that all are free. And, that's like that's a kind of continuity and change, right? For Aristotle, a slave was just a tool that spoke.
Yeah.
Right. But in the modern epoch, you get like the abolition movement, right? Where people are understood as owning their own labor, their own property, right? And so like, to think about, history as, to think about history, what Hegel calls it is, philosophical history, which is different than, the kind of the journalism or what he calls reflective history. Anyway, But that in and of itself is a very modern conception, right? That Hegel is historical, right? And there's a way in which like the Hegelian system comes into crisis in the 19th century. And there's all these people that are like, down with Hegel, right? Even, you get like a Nietzsche who's informed by Hegel, right? But like recognizing that, there's a sickness in society. We're suffering from this like historicism, that there seems to be like a break with that narrative of the development, the consciousness of humanity's freedom. So it's interesting, like, if you just flat, I guess like I'm not, the periods help at least maybe not to flatten history to the point where we're kind of immediately identifying, like, what does Aristotle mean to you? And like, that's cool to a certain degree, but also to recognize the difference.
No, agree. And yeah, I mean, no, agreed. And I guess maybe just a last thought for me on this is, or maybe two, it might be interesting. I mean, a lot of historians do think that Brown does a pretty good job of chunking out late antiquity. And Scott notes a lot of problems with the way we think about early modernity from 1350 to like 1750 or whatever. But he does also point out there's like a ton of changes at like so many levels of society that starts taking place around 1350. Some choices are definitely a lot better than others. And we're probably not going to get away with it. So, maybe the thing is I think in all areas of scholarship, we don't want to be overly skeptical, like mindlessly or foolishly skeptical, but we can't be complacent. We have to keep, examining, everything, you know what I mean? Put everything under the microscope every day, and just deal with tensions and imperfection. That's the way of the world, it's fun. Does that sound fair to you, Josh?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
That sounds like, how we're trying to perfect ourselves. We keep, looking at our mistakes and saying, oh, well, maybe that's not right. And then just this whole, timeline of us trying to perfect ourselves.
That's very well said.
Yes, Story. The trying to change ourselves, like, all of history is, experience, but the question is, the transformation of it, I would say.
So take classes, all of you, in history and humanities.
And the sincerest thanks to Dr. Wolf. Thank you so much for first dedicating your time to putting this presentation together, and then taking time in your evening to come and talk to us. We really, really appreciate it. And also thank you to everyone that kind of hung around for the extended, if Les and I get to talk, we're just going to talk and talk. But thank you so much for hanging around. And Les, any final words or plugs, or
No, again, just take classes in history, humanities, philosophy, and in Humanities Fest. Attend more events.
Thank you very much. All right, well, we will declare victory for this evening. Again, thank you, and I hope you all have a good rest of your evening.
Take care. Anybody know any history jokes?
Mine are all out of date.
Oh my goodness. How? Oh, I think that should just be the evening.
That's a good one.
That was worth it. That will make it all. That's the highlight of the evening, by the way.